The time has come, the walrus said, to speak of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. Oh, wait, that's something else. Actually, today we're going to talk about chapter 23 in our microbiology text by Tortora, microbial diseases of the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. We'll do a first part and then we'll break it in half and do a second part after. Probably a little bit more, trying to make a little bit shorter videos, like making them kind of long lately, I think maybe. Anyway, cardiovascular system circulates blood through all the body's tissues and all the capillaries that are close to all the cells to feed them. There's arteries, big vessels to carry blood away from the heart. Capillaries are where the diffusion takes place, tiny microscopic vessels, and then they come together into veins, which brings blood back to the heart. So they deliver nutrients and oxygen to all the cells, carry away carbon dioxide and other cellular waste products away for getting rid of out of the body. Here's a little diagram of the cardiovascular system. The red, a lot of the red are arteries, a lot of the blue is veins, except on the, you can see the circulation going to the lungs is reversed. Arteries are blue going away because that's deoxygenated blood going back to the heart to become reoxygenated, and red pulmonary veins coming back to the heart are rich in oxygen. So, okay. The lymphatic system is a separate system of vascular tissue. It's vessels, pipes that pick up through microscopic capillaries fluid that leaks out of the blood capillaries and then return it through larger and larger coming together of lymphatic vessels and brings all the fluid that leaks out of capillaries back into the blood. That fluid that's picked up, that has leaked out of capillaries, is picked up by the lymphatic system, is called lymph. So those lymph capillaries pick it up. Along the way, if you look at the lymphatic system, there's lots of little bulges within the lymphatic vessels, and those are called lymph nodes, and they are lymphoid tissue, reticular connective tissue, and they contain lymphocytes, B cells, T cells, macrophages, dendritic cells. So they're immune tissue. If they get swollen, because there's an inflammation in there due to an infection, that's called, they become visible or palpable. That's called buboes. So here's a little diagram of a lymphatic capillary. Here's some blood capillaries, and there's a little bit of fluid leaking out very slowly out of those capillaries all day long. And the lymphatic capillaries pick up that fluid and then return it right into the bloodstream. You can see right here and right here, right here and right here, if you can follow my cursor, are where two lymphatic ducts carry all the fluid right back into the blood. It's not very much fluid. 1.1 to 2 mils per minute throughout the entire body. And I guess it adds up. If it wasn't for the lymphatic system, we'd run out of blood volume relatively quickly. Here's a little relatively rough sketch of a lymph node. There's different follicles or chambers, collections of lymphocytes attached to reticular fibers in there that can do some immune surveillance. We talked about the immune system before in some detail. So there's follicles packed with B cells surrounded by dendritic cells in here. There's some T lymphocytes on their way traveling through, looking for any problems or looking for some immunological action. Helper T cells coming in, cytotoxic T cells coming in, coming through, checking. Macrophages in this inner part of the of the core of the lymph node, the medulla, to gobble up any debris, clarify the fluid. All right. Some definitions. Septicemia, if there's pathogens or there are toxins in the blood, that's septicemia. It should be sterile, obviously. There should be no microorganisms in the blood. Sepsis is a systemic inflammatory response, and it means that there's an infection so great that the degree of inflammation, the cytokines, circulating cytokines, have risen to a concentration where it's having an impact on the overall body function. Lymphangitis is an inflammation in a lymph vessel due to an infection that's kind of advancing. Severe sepsis when you have sepsis and there's a severe infection and it's impacting the body, it could get to the point where the blood pressure starts to really tank and there's not enough, therefore, blood flow to meet the needs of the tissues. You're going to have organ failure following that. So this is a very, very serious condition. Septic shock is what it's called, when that blood flow is so low that the organs really are failing because of decreased blood pressure. That's septic shock. It's a form of circulatory shock, and there's just not enough blood flow to meet the needs of the tissues of the body, and the tissues start to die. There's a little picture of lymphangitis. There's an inflammation that's progressing along this lymph vessel. You wouldn't normally know there's a lymph vessel there, but there's some infection that's advancing its way along, and as it does so, it kicks up inflammation, and it's advancing towards the ducts that carry the lymph fluid back to the blood. So it's going towards the chest, towards the closer to the heart. Not so great. All right, gram-negative sepsis. Gram-negative bacteria, as you know, have lipid A in the outer membrane, which is extremely inflammatory to mammals and people. So if you have a large quantity of gram-negative bacteria in your body, you could have endotoxic shock. That means there's enough endotoxin present to cause a big drop in blood pressure. It inhibits heart function and causes vasodilation because of all the inflammation, and you're going to not have enough blood delivery. Endotoxins are lipopolysaccharides, specifically lipid A. What are some examples? Klebsiella species, E. coli, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Elizabeth Kingia. That's interesting, isn't that a name? It's a emerging pathogen. It's a bacteria that's very common in the environment, but just of late, it's starting to become a problem because it's developed antibiotic resistance, and it's become commonplace in healthcare settings. So now we have an emerging nosocomial pathogen on our hands. If you have a gram-negative infection, treating immediately with antibiotics can cause death. It can cause worse situation because all of a sudden you kill a large number of bacteria at once, and they all release their lipid A, and you have massive inflammation. So it's have to be strategic about how to treat that. All right. Gram-positive sepsis. A lot of gram-positive bacteria produce exotoxins that can cause toxic shock syndrome. Enterococcus faecium and Enterococcus fecalis are common residents in the colon, but in the healthcare setting, they're everywhere, right? Because all the patients are sick and undergoing all kinds of invasive treatments, and there's a little bit of feces here and there. And as you know, it's harder to disinfect in the presence of organic material. And plus, there's resistance to antibiotics. And so between those two things, it's very easy for Enterococcus, these two Enterococcus species, to get onto catheters and onto medical equipment and cause disease, cause gram-positive sepsis. Group B streptococci, strep A galactiae, causes neonatal sepsis, can cause outbreaks in neonatal clinics, birthing wards. Puerperal sepsis. Puerperal period is the period after delivery of a child, and typically, if there's an infection in the reproductive tract somewhere after that process, it's strep pyogenes is what's behind it. It can be lethal, can affect the uterus, and can progress to an infection of the abdominal cavity and cause peritonitis. That's the lining of all the organs in the abdominal cavity, the serous membranes. So that's a very potentially serious condition. We talked about it way back when we talked about Semmelweis, and he was the one that discovered that puerperal fever was killing off upwards of 40% of all the women who came into this particular hospital to deliver their babies, and he figured out it was because of medical students and physicians going directly from surgery into delivering babies, or even worse, directly from dissecting cadavers for instructional purposes into delivering babies and carrying the bacteria in with them. And he instituted washing the hands and you cut way down on that process. So that's where you've seen that before. Infections of the heart. The inner lining of the heart can be infected, endocarditis that's called, because the endocardium is just a lining of tissue on the inside of the heart, um, and epithelial tissue, endothelial cells, same cells that line all the blood vessels, also form an inner layer on the surface of the heart, and they can become infected. Subacute bacterial endocarditis can impair the function of the heart valves. Alpha hemolytic streptococci from an oral or tonsillar infection. Um, they can get into the blood, and then they can find their way to the heart and then colonize the endocardium. Acute bacterial endocarditis, that's caused by Staphylococcus aureus bacteria getting in there, very rapid growing, and cause inflammation and injury to the heart. One thing that can happen is inflammation can cause the outer lining of the heart, the pericardium, to become inflamed. And if that happens, then fluid starts to accumulate. There's a fibrous pericardium that's like a leather satchel around the heart. And if the serous membrane that lines that fibrous pericardium becomes inflamed, fluid will build up between the two serous membranes. There's one on the surface of the heart and one on the surface of the fibrous pericardium. They're supposed to just glide on one another, but if you start filling it with fluid, that fibrous pericardium will not expand. So if you fill fluid in there between the serous membranes, the heart can't fill. The heart can't expand because there's just too much fluid taking up that space. So that's a very serious condition that can occur from pericarditis. Streptococci are generally the bacteria involved in that process. Here's a picture of bacterial endocarditis, and the bacteria have colonized the endocardium, the surface, but they've also then worked their way into the tissue. These are called vegetations in the tissue, this growth of material, bacteria plus fibrin inside the heart tissue, and it's going to destroy the heart tissue. Rheumatic fever is a complication of Streptococcus pyogenes infections. An antibody response, a normal antibody response when someone gets a strep infection, a strep throat, antibodies against M proteins can then ultimately cross-react with self antigens and cause an autoimmune disease. It's going to cause inflammation of the heart valves, and when the heart valves are no longer supple and flexible and get stiffened and inflamed, then the heart valves don't open and close properly, and that's going to cause a huge impact on efficiency of the heart. It can be very bad. Subcutaneous nodules can form at the joints, and we'll see a picture of that in a second. Sydenham's chorea, in children especially, just random purposeless movements of the extremities, most common in the face, but it could be in the extremities. If you're interested in something I think you'll find somewhat curious, just Google that term and look at some videos of children with Sydenham's chorea. And there's one of those rheumatic fever nodules forming near the elbow joint there. Tularemia. It's a disease related to rabbits. Francisella tularensis is a gram-negative bacillus. It's a zoonotic disease. It's the reservoir is rabbits, and rabbits and ticks and deer fly bites are what transmit the disease to humans, or that you can inhale an aerosol or landscaping dust that has the bacteria in there from the host. If someone has a rabbit colony raises rabbits, they're at risk. Somebody who's a hunter or a taxidermist out in the wild a lot at risk for getting tularemia. The bacteria can reproduce. Well, first of all, it causes an ulcer at the site of entry, and the bacteria can reproduce in phagocytes, and so it can't be killed easily like that. So it enlarges the nearby lymph node. If there's a cut on the finger where the where the bacteria got into the skin, then it'll be the lymph nodes in the axial region or in the arm that are swollen. If it's in the foot or leg, then the lymph nodes in the inguinal region will be enlarged buboes. If it gets into the skin, less than 3% mortality rate. inhalation of the bacteria into the lungs, about a 30% mortality rate. So pretty terrible. It's one of the ones, I don't know if I'll remember to mention in each case, but there are a number of agents that have been identified by Homeland Security as being potential biowarfare weapons. And one of them is Francisella tularensis, because it can be made easily aerosolized, and it's quite a severe disease. And here's a incidence map of, or a case map of tularemia in the United States between 2005 and 2015. Not super common, as you can see. So a 27-year-old woman has a fever and a cough for 5 days. She's hospitalized when her blood pressure drops. Despite an aggressive treatment with fluids and massive doses of antibiotics, she dies 5 hours after hospitalization. Catalase negative, gram-positive cocci. So we're talking streptococcus, probably Streptococcus pyogenes, probably puerperal fever. Got this woman. There's the gram-positive bacteria stained right there. There's a little review table you can use. We're going to go on now and talk about some more agents down there that you see more pathogens. Brucella, caused by bacteria in the genus Brucella. They're aerobic gram-negative coccobacilli, and their reservoir is in animals. You can get transmission usually by contaminated milk from infected animals, but you can get contaminated directly by the animals, or around the farmyard, where the animals are. It can become airborne, and you can inspire it in the dust into your lungs. It can persist in the reticuloendothelial cells, in other words, macrophages, just like we've been talking about with the last, like with tularensis. Tularemia can survive and either evade phagocytosis or survive in macrophages. So symptoms of malaise: night sweats, muscle aches, and weaknesses. It's not usually fatal. The telltale symptom of brucellosis, it's called undulant fever, and it has this fever that rises and falls and rises and falls, spikes each evening. It always remains somewhat elevated, though. We'll encounter another organism that causes a starting and stopping fever. This one stays a little bit higher during the troughs. So it's called undulant fever. I guess I wrote it enough times there just to make sure. It's also called Malta fever or Mediterranean fever. Anthrax. We've encountered this one before, and this is a real bad one. And when we learned about it, we talked about how important it was as an agricultural problem in Europe, and some of our historically famous microbiologists, pioneers, were interested in trying to figure out what to do about anthrax and how to identify its cause and treat it in livestock. Well, people can get anthrax. It's a common soil bacterium, Bacillus anthracis. It affects grazing animals. The spores are introduced into the body and taken up in macrophages, and then they germinate and start to multiply. Bacteria get in the bloodstream and release toxins. It can be treated with ciprofloxacin, or doxycycline. The best way to prevent anthrax infections in people is to vaccinate livestock, and that's what's normally done in order to prevent this problem, prevent the loss of the livestock, and also prevent the reservoirs for human infection. So, protective antigen binds the toxins to target cells, and then the toxin gets brought right into the cells and kills cells. There's an edema toxin, causes swelling, and causes swelling in the lungs. Has an amino acid capsule, interestingly, not a polysaccharide capsule that helps it avoid the immune response. But a lethal toxin helps it kill cells, and it's a very dangerous infection. Cutaneous anthrax, if you get a sore, it'll form an ulcer in the skin with like a black scab on it. Has about a 20% mortality rate without treatment. But of course, if you get a large ulcer on your skin, you're going to get something done about it in this country anyway. Gastrointestinal anthrax, if you eat some contaminated beef, for example, there's about a 50% mortality rate. And then here's the big problem, inhalational anthrax. If you inhale some endospores, a sufficient number of endospores, I think the dose is quite low, infectious dose is quite low. It'll progress to septic shock. We talked about the demon toxin and the the cell-killing toxin, and those are going to destroy your lungs and cause uh, cause shock and death. 100% mortality rate if you inhale more than a few endospores of this stuff. Um, there's a picture of an anthrax lesion on the skin, cutaneous anthrax. Just for fun, there's lots of cases in which um, microbes have been used as weapons in the past. Um, Plague-ridden bodies used by the Tartar army against Kaffa in 1346. I don't know who Kaffa is. I didn't do my homework. You can look that up. 1937, a little bit later. Plague-carrying flea bombs were used in the Sino-Japanese War, Chinese-Japanese War. 1979, Bacillus anthracis weapons plant in the Soviet Union exploded. So countries have been working on biowarfare weapons for a long, long time. 1984, Salmonella enterica was used against the people of Oregon, a particular town in Oregon. Vindictive person in a workplace who was angry with her co-workers and brought in something for them to eat, some delectable sweet muffins, and laced them with Salmonella enterica to punish them. 1996, Shigella dysentery used to contaminate food. 2001, Bacillus anthracis distributed in the United States through the postal system to various Congress people. And there's a big scare, and they had to empty out the entire Congress entirely, and basically sterilize the entire building. Everyone was out of the government buildings for months. It was quite an upheaval because someone mailed very, very highly sophisticated fine ground powders with Bacillus anthracis endospores into people. When they would open up the letter, a little cloud would come out, and there were some fatalities. I can't remember how many people died. I want to say 11, but I'm not sure of that. Quite shocking. So anyway, when I mentioned that bioweaponization of Brucella bacteria, there's several Tularemia, tularensis, Brucella, number of bacteria that we're talking about in this chapter. Bacillus anthracis are all candidates for weaponization. So the Department of Homeland Security has to think about how to ameliorate a problem if someone poisons our army or our civilian population with these things. So there's a list of some organisms that are on the list of bacteria and viruses that are considered weaponizable. Very interesting. And not so great, right? Gangrene. Gangrene is basically rotting of your tissues before your eyes. Um, it's allowed to occur because of ischemia, loss of blood supply to a tissue. That's what ischemia means, or insufficient blood supply. And when the tissue starts to die, that's called necrosis. And when you have necrotic tissue, it's like leaving meat out on your counter. It's just gonna rot. Bacteria are gonna get in there and start to gobble it up. And gangrene is the death of the soft tissue and the infiltration of bacteria that are going to eat it up. Gas gangrene is caused by Clostridium perfringens, and it gives off gas as it's metabolizing. So there's like a brownish bubbling fluid coming out of the dead tissue. That's a hallmark of gas gangrene. It produces toxins that continue to kill more tissue and move along, and it'll just progress, and it has to be removed. The dead tissue has to be removed by either amputation or debridement if possible, and in order to save the rest of the body. One interesting treatment, a hyperbaric chamber. Besides removing the necrotic tissue, you can put the limb or the body in a hyperbaric chamber. You're putting them in a chamber and cranking up the pressure of oxygen to several atmospheres pressure of pure oxygen. That will help force oxygen to penetrate down into all the tissues, and the bacteria are obligate anaerobes. and that can suppress the growth of the Clostridium perfringens bacteria. There's a picture of some gangrene on the small toe. Systemic diseases caused by bites and scratches. Quite a few ER visits by people that have been bitten by dogs and cats. Um, dogs, 80% of all reported bites. Um, well, in their saliva is Pasteurella multocida, and that's a very, very aggressive gram-negative bacillus that causes sepsis, gets right into the tissues and starts to grow. And so getting a severe dog bite is a non-trivial thing. It has to be taken very seriously. It can cause severe infections, and also Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and Crinibacterium species can get in there and cause very severe infections. So that's no joke. If you get bitten by a dog, you shouldn't just say tough it out. You should go have it cleaned out and looked at and take some antibiotics from your healthcare provider. Cat scratch disease. Bartonella henselae is a bacterium, an aerobic gram-negative bacterium that is common in cats. Something like half of cats are infected with it. It multiplies in the digestive system of the fleas, and so it keeps the cats infected and spreads from cat to cat. And when you get scratched by a cat that's contaminated or that's infected, you'll be inoculated with the bacteria, and it forms a papule at the infection site, a little swollen spot, and then it progresses to the nearest lymph nodes and forms buboes, swollen lymph nodes. A prolonged fever, headache, and fatigue is the symptoms of Bartonella henselae. It's not a fatal disease by any means. And there you can see Bartonella bacteria inside of a red blood cell. That's where it lives in the cats. Rat bite fever. Streptobacillary rat bite fever it's called. Streptobacillus moniliformis in North America causes this disease. It's a filamentous gram-negative pleomorphic, meaning many-shaped, fastidious microorganism. Causes fever and chills, muscle pain, and a mortality rate of about 10%. So, yeah, good idea to if you live in the city. I'm not saying you shouldn't live in the city. It's a great idea. If we can revitalize our cities, the more the better. But you have to be sure about the rat situation in your house or in the neighborhood, and make sure your house is well protected from you ever getting a rat bite. Spurler fever, Spirullium minus, causes another rat bite type of a fever, different microorganism. So a 10-year-old girl is admitted to the local hospital after having a fever for 12 days and back pain for 8 days. Bacteria cannot be cultured from the tissues. She has a recent history of dog and cat scratches. So that's good. That's a giveaway, right? The prolonged fever of Bartonella henselae, cat scratch fever. There's her little lesion at the site of the scratch. A 22-year-old soldier returning from a tour of duty in Iraq has 3 painless skin ulcers. She reports being bitten by insects every night. Ovoid protozoa-like bodies are observed within her macrophages by examination with a light microscope. What infections could cause these? I think we're ahead of ourselves, possibly. We still have to talk about Chagas disease, leishmania, and babesiosis, and I think that's what we're looking at there. All right, so plague, bubonic plague, this is the more formal name, caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, a gram-negative rod. It's an enteric, and it's transmitted by rat fleas. Endemic to rats, ground squirrels, and prairie dogs. You know how cute prairie dogs are. Well, they tell you to stay away from the prairie dogs if you go to visit Colorado because they can carry Yersinia pestis, and you really don't need to get plague. The bacteria blocks the flea's digestive tract. The flea bites the host and then regurgitates the blood, and then that gets into the wound, and now you have been inoculated with Yersinia pestis potentially. Bacteria enter the bloodstream and proliferate. in the lymphoid tissues. Um, Swelling of lymph nodes called buboes. Yet another disease of buboes, probably the most impressive buboes that you'll see in plague. There's a picture of some buboes in the inguinal region. This is the inguinal region. There's a concentration of lymph nodes in the inguinal region, in the axillary region, in the cervical or neck region of the body. So bubonic plague, 50 to 75% mortality rate. These guys can grow in the blood and in the lymphoid cells, in the white blood cells. Septicemic plague, septic shock, when the disease progresses and there's enough bacteria in the blood, it'll cause inflammation and vasodilation and drop in blood pressure and septic shock. You can get the bacteria into your lungs. Pneumonic plague. It's easily sprayed by aerosols, droplets. If someone around you has it and sneezes and you inhale it or isn't even talking, you inhale the aerosol, you're talking about a 100% mortality rate. Very terrible disease, and as we know from our history lessons, killed large percentages of the entire European population over a course of a few hundred years. Antibiotics can be used prophylactically. There's a picture of bubonic plague where the tissue is dying from this massive amount of bacteria that's growing in there and just killing the tissue. It's one of the reasons probably it's called the Black Plague or Black Death. So it's endemic in the United States. Not a lot of cases, luckily. From over a 16-year period, you can see how many cases were reported. Still 0 would be better. Relapsing fever. Remember we learned about undulant fever. Well, this is relapsing fever. Borrelia, a Borrelia species causes this disease, transmitted by ticks that feed on rodents and also by lice that feed on humans that are infected. Causes a high fever and jaundice. It causes liver inflammation and jaundice. The liver can't pick up bilirubin that's produced by recycling red blood cells, so it just accumulates in the blood and it makes your whites of your eyes look yellow. If you have lighter skin, it makes your skin look yellow, and so forth. Also causes rose-colored skin spots, a type of rash. The fever drops down basically to normal and then recurs, and then drops to normal, recurs, successive relapses, each one becoming less severe. That's the relapsing fever idea. Treatment is by tetracycline. Another Borrelia species, Borrelia burgdorferi, causes Lyme disease, and it's the most common tick-borne disease in the United States, unfortunately spreading. Reservoir is field mice, and the vector is Ixodes ticks, deer ticks. They feed on the mice and then bite humans. They also feed on deer. They take a blood meal from deer. So they're all on the deer. The deer march them all around the forest. And they stick to all the vegetation. So if you go for a walk in the woods or even in the fields, there's probably ticks all hanging on all the foliage. And then they're going to get onto your skin. And if you're not vigilant about it, they're going to bite you. And after 2 or 3 days of biting, they'll transfer the Borrelia spirochetes into your blood. Now you have Lyme disease. And there you can see the density of the reports of Lyme disease in the country. Started in Connecticut. I don't know where it originally came from, but spread to the northeast and it's working its way west through the Great Lakes area, but it's starting to appear all over the country. So here's kind of the little diagram showing the life cycle. We have ticks. They feed on the deer for a blood meal so they can reproduce, and the female tick lays eggs, and the larvae hatch and get onto the mice, and the mice get infected with Borrelia, and then the ticks mature and they get onto dogs or onto people. It's easy if your dog goes out running in the woods and then gets the tick onto yourself. But anyway, if you do go running in the woods, walking in the woods or the fields, you should check your whole body over when you get home. Make sure you don't have any tiny, these are very, very small sized ticks. They're not the great big dog ticks. Uh, Big gray dog ticks, those are big bulbous body things. These are little tiny uh, brown or black ticks, and they're really hard to kill. They're hard as anything. Um, there's a little picture of the Borrelia spirochetes that will burrow right into your tissues. So the first phase of the infection forms a bullseye rash and flu-like symptoms. As the disease progresses, you'll have irregular heartbeat. It can cause an encephalitis, which causes uh, um, psychological changes and facial paralysis. The third phase causes arthritis due to an inflammatory immune response. That's a pretty serious state. Once you get to the third phase like that, there's probably some irreparable damage that's been done in your body. Um, Diagnosis with ELISA or indirect fluorescent antibody test for these Borrelia. Western blot is another thing that can be used to identify it. Treated with antibiotics. The later the stage, the harder it is to eradicate this from your body. It's almost like you're stuck with it after a while for some reason. Very hard to kill off all the Borrelia. There's a picture of the bullseye rash, that first stage of the disease. All right, let's leave it there, and we'll come back for a part 2. It's surprising how many diseases are that get into the circulation and so forth. So try to meet me back here for part 2 of chapter 23.